Thanks so much, Andy. Well, in a little while, we're going to be going, hopefully, into small groups. Some of you might be meeting, if possible, physically together in your country. A lot of us are going to be meeting in little Zoom groups to give sample evangelistic talks to each other, just as we've heard Helder give one to us. And we're going to receive some constructive feedback in our small groups. And you may be wondering, why do we spend so much of our four-year conference hearing evangelistic talks and then responding to them? And that is, as I said earlier, because one of the best ways to learn how to give evangelistic talks ourselves is to listen to other people and to watch other people do it to us. And we can learn so much. And I have to say, I have learned most in evangelism, not from seminars and books, but from simply watching and going with other evangelists and seeing how they communicate the gospel in a university setting. And I was privileged, as I mentioned last night, to spend about 10 years traveling with Michael Green and watching and listening to him as he presented the gospel in universities. And I learned so much, but I've also learned much from other evangelists from many parts of Europe, indeed many parts of the world. And one of the things that we want to encourage you to do is to learn from as many people as possible. Someone once said that if you learn from one person, you will become a bad clone of that person. You'll never be as good at being them as they are at being them. If you learn from two people, you'll become confused. But if you learn from lots of people, you'll become yourself. Because actually, as we learn from a wide range of other evangelists, all who have different personalities, different ways of communicating, we will actually discover our own way of communicating. One person said that evangelism and preaching is truth through personality. And one of the things we want to do is communicate the gospel, which doesn't change, through our unique and specific personality. So how can we learn to give good evangelistic talks? Well, we watch and listen to other people. But what do we watch and listen out for when we're watching other people, as we're going to be doing in our small groups in a little while, as we've already done with Helder this morning, and as we'll be doing tomorrow with Glenn and with Julia on Saturday? I want to just basically give us a little bit of advice on how we can listen well to an evangelistic talk, and then how we can translate that into giving our own evangelistic talks. What can we listen out for? It's quite easy to say, that was a good talk, or sadly sometimes to say, that was an awful talk. But how can we know what makes a good talk good and what made the bad talk bad? That's always a good thing to think about whenever you're listening to a talk. Well, as we communicated out to you before the conference, there are three aspects really that we're looking for in a good evangelistic talk. We want a good evangelistic talk to have identification, to connect with its audience. Secondly, we want a good evangelistic talk to persuade. And then thirdly, we want it to invite, inviting people to make that next step, either to trust Christ or to take a step of investigating the claims of the Christian faith further. So let's think about those for a few moments. Identification. How do people identify with their audience? There are lots of ways that we do that, aren't there? We do that by the very language that we use, not just, of course, speaking the same language, English or Spanish or Portuguese or whatever it might be, but even down to the kind of colloquial language that we might use, speaking in the way that our audience would be used to, making sure that we're not using religious or theological jargon, breaking things down into vivid language that paints pictures in people's minds. We also want to identify with people by the quotes that we use. We want to quote from people that they would listen to, people that they would read, shows that they would have watched, films that they would have been to see. And the stories that we tell can connect. So if we're speaking to students, then telling stories from our own student days can identify immediately with the audience and help them connect with us. Telling stories about our own lives can also invite people to see that we're more than just a person standing up giving a talk. We're a human being. Wasn't it nice to see Helder's family at the beginning, and just a little invitation to see that this is more than just a man giving a talk. This is a father, this is his family, and it helps us to connect with him in that way. We also identify with the questions that we anticipate and the concerns that we connect with. We want to show that we understand the kind of questions that people might be asking as they come to the event, but also as they hear what we're saying. Did you notice how Helder anticipated some of the kind of apologetic objections that came up throughout the talk? So when we state things that might be raising questions in people's minds, we can identify One person said that good preaching is a dialogue with one person doing all the talking. In other words, it's a dialogue in that we're raising verbally the questions that other people are raising mentally in their minds. We can see that when you read through, say, the book of Romans. Paul is always anticipating the questions of his audience as he goes along. But the question is, how do we identify well with our audience? How do we make that connection? And there's lots of ways that you might think about doing that: reading books, reading newspapers, making sure that we're connected in with culture. But of course, the best way to make sure that we can identify and connect with the people that we're speaking to is to spend time speaking to the people that we're speaking to. And that's why it's really important, if we're to be a public communicator of the gospel, we also spend time personally talking to those with whom we're trying to publicly connect. It was interesting listening to an interview of Tim Keller. When Tim Keller planted Redeemer Church in New York City, he actually spent a good deal of time simply meeting up one-to-one with residents of the city, doing seeker Bible studies with them, because he wanted to get to know not only what people in New York were like, but what were their questions that they had when they started to investigate the Christian faith. And because he had spent so much time one-to-one meeting with people in that city, when he started to preach publicly to large crowds in that city, he was able to connect in a profound way. He did it by knowing people. It was a great joy, as I said, to work with Michael Green. Michael was separated by several generations from the students that he was speaking to, and yet he was able to connect and identify in a very powerful way, not because he was a student. He was basically like a great-granddad to some of the students. But the difference was Michael spent lots of time talking to students one-to-one. And because he spent time chatting to them and listening to them, he was able to connect with them. So there is no substitute to actually spending time with the people that we're trying to reach. And that will really help us to connect. Listen well, and that will help us to identify. So that's the first part to good communication. We want to listen out for identification. And when you're listening to the talks later on, that's one of the questions that you want to ask of them. How does this talk identify with the audience? And you need to bear in mind that the audience may not be you. The audience may be a university campus in a country you've not been to. So you need to try and put yourself in the mindset and position of the intended audience of that particular talk. Secondly, we want a good evangelistic talk to persuade. And so we want to be asking, how can we persuade people? If you look through the New Testament, particularly the book of Acts, we see that this word persuade comes up repeatedly. We didn't just see people communicating objective truths. We see that the apostles were seeking to persuade. They were seeking to debate. They were seeking to plead, to implore, to urge, to reason. All of these words imply that we're not simply stating facts, but we're trying to communicate them in such a way that they persuade people's minds and they also persuade people's hearts. Now, I want to say there are two aspects to good persuasion. There's a destructive aspect and there's a constructive aspect to it. Destructively, what we're wanting to do is to take down the false worldviews that people already have in their minds. We want to show that those worldviews, those belief systems that they have, are neither true nor good when it comes to real life. And so you have to actually ask yourself, what is the worldview of my audience? And there might be many. In Western Europe particularly, often that worldview will just be a kind of general secularism. People may not call themselves an atheist, but they're functionally living their life in that way. Of course, we may have people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds in our audience. It's quite common in some contexts to speak to a number of people from a Muslim background, which would be a very different worldview that we might want to anticipate. We may have people who are nominally Christian, who might call themselves Christian, but have a little understanding of how that really works out in practice. So we want to ask ourselves, what is the worldview and how can we connect with that? We want to show that actually their worldview, it doesn't really work in practice. Paul talks about demolishing strongholds and everything that sets itself up against Christ. And that's one of the things that we're wanting to do. Now, we can do it gently. We don't want to go in swinging a sledgehammer and destroying the person along with their worldview. But we do want to help people to see that their current way of seeing the world doesn't really work. Otherwise, it's very comfortable for them to simply say, well, that's nice for you. I've got my own beliefs. We want to, as Francis Schaeffer said, and Lindsay reminded of it last night, take the roof off people's positions and show that their position isn't really tenable in the day-to-day reality of life. And I would suggest actually that the global pandemic has done that for a lot of people, because it's confronted us with the reality of what life is really like, even as a student. Sometimes that might happen much later. It's happened to people right now. Do they have a worldview, a belief system that can cope with it? So gently push back on that. And one of the best ways to do that is to ask questions, to gently ask how that works out for people, how they make sense of life. And we'll be seeing good examples of that throughout this week. So that's the destructive element of persuasion. But the constructive element is that we want to show people that, in contrast, the gospel, the Christian worldview, is both true and good. It's beautiful. Pascal, the French mathematician, says, make Christianity attractive, make good men wish that it was true, and then show them that it is. It's interesting, Pascal's order there. He says, actually, we need to paint the attractiveness of the gospel first, and then present the objective truth of the gospel second. Often we kind of get it the other way around. We think we just need to persuade people that the Christian faith is true, that the Bible is reliable, that the resurrection happened, and then we can move on to show how the gospel is beautiful. But of course, if we do that, then people have maybe a prior conviction as to why they don't want it to be true, because they don't think it's good. So Pascal's saying, actually help people to see the beauty, the goodness of the gospel first, and then show people its truth. So in our persuasion, we're wanting to do those two aspects: destructively showing people that their worldview is neither true nor good when it comes to the reality of life. And in contrast, that the gospel, the Christian message, is true and it is beautiful. It makes sense and it stands up to objective scrutiny. So that's persuasion. And again, that's one of the things that we want to look out for as we listen to talks this week. We're not simply saying, how did this state objective truths, but how did that persuade me? How did it persuade my mind? But also, how did it persuade my heart? And we want to think about how we can do that really well. And then the third aspect that we want to look out for in any evangelistic talk is, how did the speaker invite me to respond? How did they invite me to respond to what I've heard? Because an evangelistic talk is not simply communicating the gospel, it's inviting people to respond to it. As Michael Green often said, we want to electrify the fence on which people sit. People like to sit on the fence. They like to say, I'm going to wait and do nothing about this. And we want to encourage people that they have to make some kind of response. And actually what you realize is that everyone is making a response every time you communicate the gospel. There's no such thing as no response. And I found the most helpful verses to bear in mind as we think about response is to think about those verses at the end of Acts 17. We had Acts 17 read to us last night. And at the end of Acts 17, Paul's address in Athens on Mars Hill, we read that there was a threefold response to what was said. Firstly, we read that some people mocked and ridiculed Paul. Secondly, we read that some people wanted to hear him again. They wanted to talk further. Maybe they had more questions. It was new to them. They hadn't heard this before. But then thirdly, we read that some people believed, and it says they became followers. One of them was Dionysius, an Areopagite. Another was a woman named Damaris, and a few others. So this threefold response: some people mock, some people are interested, some people believe. And I would suggest that every time we communicate the gospel, we want to anticipate that all three of those responses could be responses that would happen to us. And therefore, you want to say in my talk, how do I connect with all three of those types of people? The danger is we simply try and connect with one of them and we miss the others. So, for instance, if you place all your emphasis on connecting with the skeptic who thinks this is rubbish, what about the person who's actually ready to become a Christian? You've said nothing to help them. Or what if you really urge the person who is ready to become a Christian to take that step to trust Christ, but actually you've not addressed the skeptic or the seeker? They've now been lost in the process and they feel there's nothing for them. We need to address all three groups. So firstly, what do you do for the person who is a skeptic, who might be saying that this is rubbish? Well, one of the things that we really want to challenge them to do is to not reject it before they've looked into it for themselves. And we would want to say the best way to look into this more is to take one of the Gospels and read it for yourself. Now, you may not want to call it a gospel because that's, jargon, isn't it, to many people? Maybe you'd want to say, why don't you take one of those first century eyewitness accounts? Before you reject this, get your nose into the evidence and have a look and see for yourself what you think this is all about. You can even encourage people to pray. I often like to say to people, here's a prayer that an atheist can pray. God, I don't think you exist, but if you do, then reveal yourself to me as I read this book and help me to go where the evidence leads. And I often say to people, I dare you to pray that prayer. You've got nothing to lose if God doesn't exist, but you might find more than you bargained for. So that's what we might do for the skeptic. What about the person who is interested, who wants to find out more? Well, we need to be prepared to know what we can invite them to next. It would never be right to speak at an evangelistic event if we have no opportunity for that event to be followed on by something more. We're sowing seeds, but sometimes that seed needs to be watered before it can be harvested. And so normally we would encourage student groups to have organized some kind of follow-up course. At the moment, it may well be online, but actually follow-up courses online can be very effective, as we'll be hearing this evening. Or, of course, it could be in person. Opportunities to ask more questions, opportunities to look more at the heart of the gospel. But make sure that there is something that's set up, and then make sure that you know as the speaker what it is so that you can invite people to do that. Don't just leave that to the host. They may do it well, but they may not. So it's great that you can really reinforce that as the speaker. And then thirdly, there will be people who will be ready to respond. And we want to give people an opportunity to do that at the end of the talk. Now, it may well be that we present a talk and no one is in that position, but that's okay. Even by modeling how people can respond in repentance and faith, we are showing people what they could do at some later date, even if they don't do it right there. So normally I would try and explain what that response is. I'd try and use some kind of visual picture of response at the beginning of a relationship, the sealing of a deal, a response to an invitation, some way that visualizes in people's minds that we need to do something in response to what God has done for us. I need to explain that. I may also want to anticipate some of the questions and objections that people have at that point. At the kind of the last minute questions where people are saying, well, I've still got questions, or I've got doubts, or what will my friends think, or things like that. Just a one sentence reply to some of those objections can overcome people's last minute doubts. I remember speaking in one event and I just said, maybe you've got doubts, that's okay. You can come to Jesus with your doubts. You don't need to be 100% certain to get started with Jesus. And someone came up to me afterwards and they said, that was so helpful what you shared. I was holding back because I thought I needed to be kind of, 100% certain. And I'm not, but I'm certain enough that I want to start following Jesus. And he did that evening. And it was wonderful to help him get started. And then I'd normally suggest a prayer that people could pray. And I would say that at the front, normally quite slowly, so that people could respond with me. And then, very importantly, I want to make sure that there is some way that people can be followed up, whatever their response is. Now, if the event is online, as many events are right now, we want to make that as simple as possible. We don't want to say, go and find our Facebook page. It's somewhere on Facebook. And if you can find the little tab that's halfway down the people won't do that. Okay, we need to make it utterly simple. If they can click on something that is already on their screen so that they can then put their details in, that would be really great. And I'd suggest actually in the online world, isn't it wonderful if we could send something physically to people? So people would actually leave their address. We could send them a little pack with a gospel, with a book maybe, and maybe some sweets or some chocolates in for good measure. That would be a really nice thing to do, wouldn't it? And a very tangible physical thing to do in a virtual world. Of course, if you're in a physical event where you're meeting in person, it's great to have feedback forms. Make them very simple. 2 boxes normally that we'd have. One box that basically says, tell me more, I'm interested, but I'm not convinced. Another box that's saying, count me in. Basically, I want to get started with Jesus. You can translate them into what's helpful in your language. And then basically a space for their name and their number. We found an experience that email doesn't normally work. It just gets lost in people's spam. Try and give people a call, make personal contact as soon as possible after the event. People's interest level will drop exponentially as time goes by. So if you can catch them within 24 hours of that talk that they have been to or that they've listened to, they're much more likely to respond. So those are 3 things that I would suggest we want to look out for in a good evangelistic talk. We want to listen out for how identification is happening. We want to listen out for how they're persuading. And we want to listen out to the invitation How are they inviting people to respond? And in our small groups, in a few moments' time, that's what I'd like you to do. An ideal way of doing this is to delegate responsibility to different people in your group. So you can say to one person, I want you to listen out for the identification. For another person, I want you to listen out for persuasion, and for another, invitation. And what they can do is listen to the whole talk for when that is happening. Because it's not simply a case that we start with identification, move on to persuasion, and finish with invitation. These things need to be spread throughout our talk. We always want to be connecting with our audience. We always want to be speaking in a persuasive way. And in a sense, we want to be inviting people throughout to respond. So delegate that out in your group and then listen out for that. And that will be a great way for you to learn yourself. And then as you give feedback, you can go around the group and give feedback in those 3 particular areas. Now, just before we finish, just a few other practical tips as it comes to preparing and delivering talks that might be really helpful to us. One question that people often have is this: how do I use the Bible in an evangelistic talk? And do I start with it? Do I use it at all? And you'll see over the course of the next few days different models of how we engage with Scripture. Obviously, whenever we speak evangelistically, we want to be speaking biblically. We want what we say to be shaped by the whole message of the Bible. Now, sometimes that won't engage with a particular text or passage. Last night in Acts 17, Paul addressed the philosophers in Athens with a biblical theology on the particular topic he was addressing, but he wasn't quoting chapter or verse from the Old Testament. But actually, one of the things I find is really helpful, if we can, is to get people to look at least a verse of Scripture or a passage of Scripture as we speak, because that shows where our authority comes from. It's not us and our great wisdom that is informing what we say. Our authority comes from somewhere else. So if we can do that, that's great. Now, often starting with a Bible passage isn't so ideal when we're speaking evangelistically. We want to start by connecting with the audience and with the questions that they have. But then once we've connected, addressed the topic or the question and thought about it from different angles, it can then be really helpful to introduce a Bible text or passage and say, now we're going to look at an encounter, maybe from one of the Gospels, and see what Jesus has to say about this question or what Jesus has to say about this subject. And then we can flow out of that and allow that passage or that text to inform the shape of what we say later on. And if it's a story, obviously the narrative of that story might form the shape of what we say. So it's really helpful to do that. We want to make sure that we are speaking biblically, and one of the best ways to preach the gospel is from the Gospels. And we want to give you models and examples of how to do that. You might say, what about illustrations? It was great to hear from Helder about the way that he files his illustrations on Evernote. So basically, he's always looking out for stories, for quotes, and for ideas, and he's filing them away. I normally find once I come to prepare a talk, I do not find illustrations at that point. I'm using illustrations that I've already been aware of and have filed away before that time. So always be on the lookout for interesting stuff, and then keep a note of it so that we can draw on that in later times. It might be a thing that we've seen on the news, it might be a quote, it might be something in a film or music, but of course our own lives are rich treasure troves of stories, aren't they? Often I found the stories that really connect are those quite embarrassing stories that have happened to us in our life. And I would say as a preacher, the great thing about being a preacher is this: when things go disastrously wrong in life, at least you can say it will make a good sermon illustration. So use stories. That will help connect as well, because it will invite people to see your life, maybe some of the more embarrassing sides of your life as well. What about humor? A lot of people say, do I have to be funny when I'm presenting an evangelistic talk? Well, I would say you have to be yourself. Some people are naturally very funny people, and therefore they can get away with lots of humor without even thinking. Some people are not. That's okay. We don't need to force ourselves to be what we're not. But sometimes a bit of humor can be helpful in breaking down barriers and then helping us to connect. If we're intense and serious all the way through, well, people find it hard to engage for a long period of time in that way. If we can lighten it occasionally, then it helps people to breathe, but it also removes the barriers so that we can say something quite serious. And often the most serious and challenging point I try to make after something a little bit more light, maybe a story that's made people laugh. We can use humor effectively in that way. But be careful, sometimes humor can have the opposite effect. If we've just said something really serious and then we lighten it with a joke, we can actually stop people from really thinking about what has just been said. So we need to be careful in our use of humor. Some people say, well, should I use notes or should I not use notes? And that's a really good question. Obviously, you can see this morning I am using notes. I've got a notebook here, and this is probably how I'd normally speak if I was giving a talk. I never work from a full manuscript because I have found that if I'm working from a full manuscript, I get too stuck at reading my notes. And the problem with that is I can't look at you, the audience. The important thing is whether or not you're using notes, and however many notes you're using, that you can make eye contact. Because when you make eye contact, you suddenly realize that if you're in the audience, the speaker is not just speaking at you, they're speaking to you. So try and do that. And if you're speaking on camera, make sure you're looking at the camera, not at your face on the screen. Everyone else can look at your face, but you look at the camera so that people can see your eyes and people are engaged in that way. You'll have to work out how much notes or how many notes you need to be able to do that, but practice will really help in that regard. If you're pre-recording a talk, you've got a little bit of help here, because therefore you can do a few takes, splice them together, and no one can really know that actually between each of those takes you were quickly reading your notes. Another little tip, if you're speaking to camera, if you've got a quote, you could overlay that onto the screen. So as you read the quote, people can just read it on the screen as well. So those are little tips, but the bottom principle is make eye contact with your audience, whether it's on camera or in real life. People want to feel connection with you. And then lastly, some little tips about doing stuff online. Most of our groups are going to be on Zoom or in the next while rather than in person. And a lot of the evangelism that is happening over the course of this year is also going to be happening online. So just a few tips about that. We're going to have a whole seminar tomorrow giving you more ideas on this. But as I said, when you're speaking online, you're often looking at a laptop screen. Make sure you look at the camera, not yourself. Therefore, people are looking at you and they feel that sense of connection. It's quite hard speaking online because I know in my head that there are people all over the world right now that are watching this. At least I hope. Because there'll always be that little voice in your head that says, hey, Michael, you're standing there talking to yourself. No one is listening. So you have to pray really hard and you have to try and imagine at the other end of that camera, there are real people who are really listening and really watching. Wasn't Helder doing a really good example of this earlier? Helder was there on his own in Spain in lockdown, and yet we were here feeling that he was connecting with us. It was so engaging. He was so warm. There was humor. We were laughing. It was fantastic. So it is possible, but it takes even more energy to do that when you're doing it on camera. It doesn't mean that you wave your arms around, because that can look a little bit crazy if you're particularly in a kind of small shot. But you do want to speak with enthusiasm and earnestness. People are tired, they're fatigued, they're fed up of watching stuff online. And if you can do something that's going to stand out from the crowd, that's going to be different to their lectures that they've been watching all day, that will really help people connect. So those are just a few pieces of advice to look out for. And we're going to be going into small groups.